Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. My name is Shakeel Syed. I have the privilege to host this session today on behalf of American Muslims for Palestine. I'd like to thank each one of you, those who are joining us, regardless from where you are. God bless you for taking the time out this weekend to be with us. And on behalf of all of you, I would also like to thank each one of the esteemed panelists who have joined us today. Dr. Angana Chatterji, Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal, Dr. Wakar Uddin, and Sister Aydin Anwar. This afternoon, we will have a conversation about the idea of resisting, the idea of resistance, oppressors and oppression, but together. And I like us to think of the maxim that climate justice folks use, the butterfly effect, which is that when a butterfly flaps its wings in one place in the world, then a tornado or a typhoon or a hurricane can happen in another part of the world. Which is to say that we live in an interconnected world. What happens in one place does impact the other places. And in the context of oppression, we do see a great many similarities between many countries, many places that we all live in and work with. And this afternoon, we will take a journey, a virtual journey, in some of those places where oppression is rampant, blatant, brazen, in broad daylight. We will begin our journey in India with the help of Dr. Angana Chatterji. And then we will go in the neighborhood of India, in the Indian-occupied Kashmir. And Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal will help us inform us about what is happening in Kashmir and how Kashmiri people are resisting the oppression of the Hindu nationalist government, particularly for the last 6 years, but for the last 60, 70 years. And then we will head toward Myanmar, and our brother Dr. Wakar Uddin will help us in enlightening us about the resistance of the Rohingya people against a brutal military regime of Myanmar. And continuing on, we will end the program with an inspiring presentation by Sister Aydin Anwar, who will tell us stories of resistance from a place called East Turkistan, also known as the Xinjiang province in China. And I'm sure many of you who are joining this program may be from different places with different legacies and histories coming from different places. But in this century, at this point, we live in an interconnected world where our paths cross. And pursuit of justice is not an exclusive domain of any one people or any one faith or any one tradition. It is only and only together, resisting the oppression, we shall succeed. To begin the program today, I would like to invite Dr. Angana Chatterji, who is co-chair of the Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights Initiative, Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley. She is a cultural anthropologist, and her work is focused on issues of political conflict, majoritarian nationalism, and religion in public square. Dr. Chatterji is co-founder and convener of the People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice in Kashmir, and she also founded the People's Tribunal on Religious Freedom and Human Rights in Odisha. For those of us who are not from India or those who are not quite familiar with the geography of India, Odisha is a state in India. Dr. Chatterji's body of scholarly and research work has indeed a long list, but for the brevity of time, I would list only some that are a must read for those who are in the human rights work. Violent Gods, Hindu Nationalism in India's Present. And the other one is a majoritarian state, how Hindu nationalism is changing India, so pertinent to our conversation this afternoon. And she also wrote a seminal work on Kashmir, The Case for Freedom. And her explosive research report, known to many of us, Buried Evidence, Unknown, Unmarked, and Mass Graves in Kashmir. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Angana Chatterji. You would like to unmute yourself, Dr. Chatterji.
I'm so sorry. Hi. Thank you so much, Shakeel Bhai. It's my privilege to be here in solidarity. Today, I would like to speak to counter-memory as resistance and to fragments of what I have been privileged to bear witness to in India as well as in Kashmir. To set a context, the Hindu right's current ascent to parliamentary power in India, led by Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party, combines upper caste dominance, unequal economic development, cultural conservatism, intensified misogyny, and a firm grip on the instruments of state power. Hindu nationalists popularized the myth of Hindu culture as under siege, India as vulnerable, Hindus as vulnerable, and India as Hindu, and justify aggression. The family of Hindu right ultranationalist groups script heteronormative aggression as patriotic in militarizing social and political majoritarianism. In mobilizing a Hindu state in India today, Islamophobia fractures the fault lines of an already conflicted democracy. Two examples: prejudicial citizenship policies and laws are being utilized with impunity to privilege Hindus. Muslim men are being attributed as seducing Hindu women through love jihad with the objective of converting them to Islam. Hindu nationalists seek to punish Muslims and to rescue Hindu women. A law prohibiting such marriages was enacted last week. It imperils the sanctity of Muslims and is malvolent. It endangers religious freedom, interfaith marriage and spousal relationships, and women's agency and self-determination. My earlier point, citizenship laws in India today aim to determine to whom political and civil rights may be accorded. They are akin to the Nuremberg laws instituted in September 1935 in Nazi Germany. And then there is Kashmir. Kashmiris live in a context akin to collective internment, and I know that Hafsa will speak to it in greater detail later, so I will just make a few points. It is a place of no rights, bound by concertina wire, asphyxiating amid unending lockdowns. Every neighborhood is impaired and each life is impacted. Across Kashmiri civil society, where Muslims are in a majority, India is viewed as an occupying power. Unrelenting militaristic and legal hostility to social dissent targets Kashmiri civilians and their allies. The alignment of national security with aggressive majoritarianism prohibits reflection on the part of the Indian state on why Kashmiris resist. Such reflection is represented as seditious. Kashmir is witness to mass atrocities. India's state forces have reportedly carried out extrajudicial executions, targeting and killing Kashmiri civilians for unproven offenses. Through the protracted conflict, Kashmiris have lived in conditions that have required they endure impunity laws, displacement, enforced disappearances, sexualized violence, torture, extrajudicial executions, and the burial of civilians in unknown and mass graves. The political and social breakage of Kashmir today has its genesis in history. The unchecked spread of majoritarianism in India through the decades in which Hindu nationalists were not in elected office have created political and legal contexts whereby the dismantling of Kashmir can now occupy center stage in government. On August 5th, 2019, Kashmir's autonomy was countermanded by the Indian government as it unilaterally revoked Article 370 and Kashmir's autonomous status and Article 35A, the permanent residence law. Inhuman conditions since the lockdown have included the torture of children, the elderly, and women, illegal and mass detentions, house arrests of political leaders and human rights defenders, curtailment of freedom of speech, movement, and dissent, the falsification and amplification of social facts by the state, and the closure of sacred spaces. By March 2020, with the advent of COVID-19, health services reached a breaking point, which were already in disarray. Between January and June, 32 civilians were reportedly killed. In May 2020, with the onset of settler colonialism, certain legal barriers to permanent residency were removed to potentially reconstitute Kashmir's demographic makeup and render Muslims a minority. Kashmiris fear today the onslaught of cultural and perhaps physical genocide. I will speak today briefly in the remaining time to counter memory. I've been privileged to work with movements for justice and accountability since 1989. I have learned the capacity for effective solidarity requires continual self-reflection on my part, listening, unlearning, and humility. I would like to highlight two fragments today, one from India and another from Kashmir, that have been for me journeys in bearing witness and listening. The first fragment is from Gujarat. Following conversations with Muslim victimized survivor women and leaders that I had in 2013-14, these interlocutors, by their own expression, were impacted by the pogrom against Muslims of February-March 2002 in Gujarat, during which Mr. Modi, today Prime Minister, was then Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat. These women spoke to graphic and public sexualization of violence in urban and rural Gujarat during the pogrom. They spoke to unspeakable expanding of pain, suffering, and seeing individual and collective acts for survival and justice. They speak of healing, the impossibility that is unattainable yet imperative. These fragments evidence the hold of colossal events of more than 18 years ago on the lives of these women today as double victims of violence and the failure of accountability. They tell me that memory is a way of their resistance. She says, "We cannot forget. We are left with what we are wearing. We lived, but they died." People inside the homes, they were torched alive. We ran from the home. I saw my brother-in-law's dead body outside. If I close my eyes, even now, that is what I see in front of me. How do we forgive? The corpses we saw as we ran later disappeared. Timber logs ripped from our homes were used by the killers to burn the people they killed. They used a chemical powder that burned the bodies completely. They torched all of our belongings, bodies heaped together on a massive funeral pyre. I feel rage, I feel crazy, I feel empty. Our life has become defined by what happened. We cannot forget. That is the only way we can live. Remembrance is our resistance. Otherwise, life is overwhelming. If we tell you, you will know, you will remember. Then we will talk to others, those who are not us. And then, through that act of speaking, perhaps we are not alone. In talking about it, we are sad, yes. That sadness is deep within us. It will die with us. The second fragment is from Kashmir. The unknown, unmarked and mass graves there function as material repositories of culture, kin and community that was devastated. They are reservoirs of counter-memory and information critical to aspirations for accountability. The bodies in the graves bear evidence to bigotry, to unfreedom, to occupation and contestation. Gravediggers and other local civilians are witness to the bodies of the dead. The living memory of those affected by the unknown graves emerge as forms of culture and resistance. Memory animates details and new meanings that enable a fuller understanding of events, a commitment to not forgetting. My colleagues at the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society and I were privileged to investigate these graves between 2006 and 2009. Our report, Buried Evidence, is available online. Atta Muhammad Khan, circa 1940 to 2016, I consider him a mentor, was compelled by state forces personnel in Kashmir to become the gravedigger and caretaker of the unknown, unmarked and some mass graves at Chehal Bimyar in Baramulla district. The graveyard in Chehal is filled with loose gravel adjacent to a high school for boys. Many who live proximate to the graves experience prolonged psychosocial and physical health impacts. The dreams are animated and daily life is inhabited with unease. Atta Muhammad says, I have been terrorized by this task that was forced upon me. My nights are tormented and I cannot sleep. The bodies and graves appear and reappear in my dreams. My heart is weak from this labor. I have tried to remember all this, the sound of the earth as I covered the graves, bodies and faces that were mutilated, mothers who would never find their sons. My memory is an obligation. My memory is my contribution. I will end with another fragment, parts of interviews that I did with Atta Muhammad between 2009 and 2011 when I was last able to visit Kashmir. Atta Muhammad talked about the anticipation of death and death-boundedness that envelopes the act of living in Kashmir. He said, living here is entwined with death. The young men in the graves, they knew death even before it took them. We live among these graves. People in Kashmir lived in fear that they would be put in such a grave. This defines our resistance. The graveyard in Chehal is next to a school. Children are often terrified to walk by them. Life here is lived with the threat of death very close to it. Not having freedom is another form of death, a different form than a fake encounter. Survival in Kashmir means learning to live with death. I am tired. I am so very tired. I would like to end with one thought. Hindutva's dictum of blood, soil, and race is seeking to rewrite intricate histories to gain competitive advantage in the rigged game of nation, signaling a 21st century post-colonial turned neo-imperial rendition of despotism and the reign of majoritarian fascists in India today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterji, for speaking truth to power. As a person born in India, now unable to travel to India, says it all of what India is today. But I seek hope in Atta Muhammad, where he says, remembering is our resistance. And we shall not forget people who are being persecuted in India and the vicinity. And it's so inspiring that despite of these draconian measures and against all odds forced upon the Kashmiri people, they continue to resist against the occupation of India and for their inherent right of self-determination and to live free in their own land. And I'm so honored to have Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal with us, who is a Kashmiri American, and she works as an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College. And her scholarly and research interests include South Asia, Kashmir, Islam, women's and gender studies, and Islam in America. And Dr. Hafsa is also a member of Critical Kashmir Studies and speaks and writes frequently about Kashmir as a Kashmiri American leader in diaspora. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hafsa.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session, and to American Muslims for Palestine for hosting an important conversation about solidarities across multiple spaces of oppression. So I wanted to spend a few minutes speaking to the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir, building off of what Professor Chatterji has already shared with us, and then also give some thoughts about resistance, both in Kashmir, but also in the diaspora. So as was mentioned, last August, India revoked Kashmir's special autonomy, and people feared the reason, as Brother Shakeel mentioned earlier, Kashmir has been occupied for over 7 decades. So why was this in particular such a big deal? Basically, it turned Kashmir from a colonial state into now a settler colonial state, where there's a real fear now of demographic change and the onset of Indian settlers coming in, buying land, and changing Kashmir from a Muslim majority region to a Hindu majority region, which would then have major implications for the resolution to the whole conflict overall. And this year, especially under COVID, India has basically used the pandemic to pass a series of laws. And everything has really happened through these legal changes that they've made, where domicile, so something called domicile has been introduced, where certain categories of Indian citizens have been given access to residency rights in Kashmir, the right to the right to be able to have jobs or employment and so on, that they would actually be able to have those rights in Kashmir, which previously was not available to them. And then more significantly, there have been changes to land laws. So in the past, there were restrictions that only Kashmiri permanent residents would be able to buy and purchase land in Kashmir. And now that has been done away with. And now any Indian citizen, and you can imagine India is a country of over 1.3 billion people, can buy land in Kashmir. And the army has also been given unchecked powers to basically declare any region as strategic for whatever purposes, and just to take it over. So whereas in the past there may have been some kind of process in which you had to go through local assembly to get approval of those of that kind of land takeover, now that doesn't exist anymore because Kashmir is completely under the control of the Indian government. So there's of course fears that in addition to settlers and land being grabbed, this is going to have massive implications for Kashmir's environment. Already there is mining taking place by Indian companies, corporations, that have not received any sort of environmental clearances. And this is an ecologically contested zone. There's floods and earthquakes that happen here regularly. So there's fears about what this means for Kashmir's ecology as well. So just to give you one example of something that happened recently, Kashmiri tribals who have lived in the forest land there for decades, they were given notices that their homes were being demolished. And there's fears now that this forest land is going to be used for Indian investment purposes, for corporate power and neoliberalism. So there are a lot of things that are happening at a very fast pace. And because the world's attention is on the pandemic and other things, India is basically unchecked in terms of everything that it's doing in Kashmir. And most importantly, for our purposes, it has already articulated in many ways that it's following the Israeli settler colonial playbook. So a lot of the things that we have seen in the West Bank, especially, and from the time of the Nakba and so on, India has that model, and it's following it as we speak. And the other thing that's really important to mention is that this is happening in a time of extreme repression. When we think about resistance, we also kind of have to keep in mind how much privilege we have, despite all of the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism that exists in the West, to even be able to speak about some of these issues, to even be able to host this webinar. In Kashmir, for decades, people have not really been able to protest or have the kind of freedom of speech that we all are able to enjoy. But more recently, the clampdown has been so severe where pretty much any form of resistance, whether it's physical in terms of protests or online in terms of your social media activity, is not just punished, but actually criminalized. So young Kashmiri social media users are being called into torture centers effectively and asked about their social media use, beaten up, harassed. And then after those kinds of incidents have happened, hundreds of them are completely erased from online. And given that there's so much militarization and people are not able to even gather in place physically, online was one place where Kashmiris could potentially express themselves, but even that has been taken away from them. There's been raids against civil society organizations, including JKCCS, the organization Professor Chatterji mentioned earlier, where sensitive information that human rights organizations collect is picked up by the authorities. So it becomes extremely difficult in such circumstances for people to resist in the ways in which we see resistance, or we would imagine resistance. But that is not to say that people aren't resisting. Resistance doesn't have to be in the form of protests. For many months during the siege, Kashmiris basically just shut down completely. So there was one of the largest civil disobedient peaceful protests in the world for months at a time, where people did not go to school. Businesses were not in operation. Shops were closed for months. And this was a form of resistance as well. But of course, it did not get the attention of the international or governments or the media. And even the fruit that people had grown for that season people just left it there. So you saw these heartbreaking pictures of apples that were just left on the ground at the orchards that were not picked up to go and export around the world. So people have made a lot of sacrifices. They continue to make a lot of sacrifices. And young people there, especially those who do speak, who try to write or share their stories, I'm continually inspired by them, just because, even speaking out could potentially mean a knock at the door and a terrorism case slapped against you. So that's the kind of context in which we're dealing with. Given the level of repression then that exists, it becomes all the more important than those of us who have the privilege to be outside in the diaspora have and continue to play a role and think of ways to amplify the work and the cause here. And I want to say a bit about, for the last couple of minutes, about working together. We kind of already know there's been a lot of discussion about the ways in which India and Israel work together, cooperate significantly, both in terms of their securitization, in terms of how they frame Palestine and Kashmir under the rubric of the war on terror. India is Israel's largest buyer of arms, so there's also that military link. Israeli military officials have trained Indian officials in tactics on counterinsurgency. So there are a lot of material links there. But also in the diaspora, the Indian lobby is learning from the pro-Israel lobby in terms of how to destroy our cause abroad, right? On how to target Kashmiri activists and Kashmiri academics who are speaking out. So there's a lot of information sharing and strategy sharing that happens there too. So I think that makes it all the more important that we work together, that we continue to build these relationships, host conversations, strategize together on how to continue to fight back against both of these now settler colonial states. And really that we see our work as being interconnected. And I think it's enough to say that, yes, we are working intersectionally and talk about these similarities across these different contexts. But now I think the time has come that we actually really need to put that work into action because ultimately both our peoples, but also many of the other struggles that we're talking about today depend on it. So that's my comment.
Thank you so very much, Sister Hafsa. As you were mentioning, I was thinking comparing and contrasting has its own dynamics and challenges, but what sounds like is that West Bank and Gaza, the entire occupied Palestine, is bundled into Kashmir. So many similarities from 70 years of occupation to what's happening on the ground today. We carry on and move to the neighborhood of Kashmir in Myanmar. The Rohingya people are the indigenous people of Myanmar with a rich and long history. Their systematic erasure was started about 4 decades ago, when the Burmese military regime stripped away their citizenship, even though the Rohingyas voted for others, and they were also voted in and held positions in military and civil society. But now a genocide is unfolding against them by the military regime of Myanmar. Millions of Rohingya people are forced out of their homes, villages burned, women raped, and men are placed in concentration camps. The investigators of United Nations are banned by the military regime. I was reading somewhere that a nurse with the Doctors Without Borders said, "I have been to 7 disaster zones around the world, have never seen anywhere what's done to Rohingya women." Yet, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, denies the rapes of Rohingya women as fake rape. Despite of all the atrocities meted out to the Rohingya people over the past several decades, they keep fighting for their inherent right for human dignity, despite of myriad odds stacked against them, just like their brothers and sisters in Palestine, in India, and in Kashmir. And to share some of this, we have invited Dr. Wakar Uddin, who is a Rohingya-American, born in Arakan state in Myanmar, and he's currently a professor of philosophy at the Penn State. And Dr. Wakar is the Director General of Arakan Rohingya Union, which is a federation of several Rohingya organizations from around the world. And he's also the founding chairman of the Burmese Rohingya Association of North America. Dr. Wakar, it's my pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining this event. Today, in this session on resisting oppression together, I'll be speaking about how the Rohingya people are resisting the oppression. I'm sure you have heard times and again the Rohingya genocide on various media and events. So I'm not going into details, too much as specifics on all the aspects of the crisis, and it will take hours anyway if you go in details. But briefly, before we go to the resisting the oppression, the genocide, let me briefly mention this. Over 1.2 million Rohingya people are in refugee camps in Bangladesh. Over 200,000 people, nearly 300,000 people in IDP camp. IDP camp is an internally displaced persons camp, internal displacement, in their home state of Arakan, not too far away from their homes. And several 100,000 scattered in various parts of the world, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Europe, and North America, Australia, you name it, so all scattered. As part of that genocidal campaign against Rohingya, people have scattered, left the country. An estimated 600,000, some 600,000 Rohingya still remaining in Rakhine state, their home state of Arakan in Burma, but with no rights, no security, and no future. The crisis had gone far beyond oppression and persecution. It's simply a genocide. Of course, there are various instruments of genocide that began with oppression first, then persecution, then injustice, and the violence, killing. This systemic and systematic violation against Rohingya started with revocation of their citizenship, full citizenship, and from there, security to forceful displacement, and then various forms of genocidal acts and crimes that include mass killing, torture, rape, gang rape, elimination of homes and entire villages, torching them, and I can go on and on and on. The fundamental objective of the genocidal campaign against Rohingya is aiming at total elimination of population, entire population of Rohingya, to eliminate them, genocide, from their homeland, from their country. Now, let's talk about resistance, resisting it, how we resist in this, in line with today's event. How do we do this? The first step in resistance to Myanmar military and government starts with number one, resisting the forceful displacement. They're pushing the people out, forcing the people out. We have to resist them. Over 800,000 people have been forced out in a matter of 2 weeks in 2017, August 2017, through the military's campaign against Rohingya people. Now we still have some 600,000 people remaining in Arakan. So we have to resist. We are constantly preparing the remaining population in Arakan state on the ground to stay put, not to cross any border if there is any attempt by the military, again, to force them out to other countries in the region. Maybe Bangladesh, maybe India, maybe Malaysia, maybe Thailand. people can head to that direction when the violence return, not to stay put. Our people in Arakan, the remaining one, are now steadfast, resisting, and staying where they belong. They are determined not to leave their homeland. Number two, resisting. That is another form of resistance. That's through external forces. What do I mean that by external forces? That is the major thrust in our resistance against the genocide. Let me explain why that is, how we're doing that, why we're doing that. That is heavily internationalizing the crisis. In some, because there are some limitations in what we can do on the ground in our country, state in Myanmar, like talking about protests and other things. They will obliterate, they will flatten, they will kill entire population. So there are some limitations because Burmese military, Myanmar military is very violent, ruthless. They will not leave a single soul alive. So that we have to be careful about that. But we are resisting the staying there. But internationalizing is the very effective way of doing it. First, in internationalizing this crisis, consistent, well-coordinated, and concerted international pressure on Burma. What are these international pressure? That is at global scale. Let's start with OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It is a 57-member country organization, second largest to the United Nations, after United Nations. That leads to OIC and EU, European Union alliance, their alliance in this issue. That is a significant force at the international stage, particularly at the United Nations, in advancing the cause of Rohingya. The result of that is multi-pronged. The United Nations General Assembly, Security Council, the Human Rights Council. Remember, all these are part of the resistance. There are resolutions after resolution in United Nations General Assembly, Human Rights Council, and this issue has been brought up to Security Council many times, although there are veto stuff, and I will not get into the veto things at this point with short time. There have been several resolutions at UNGA and Human Rights Council, as well as within the OIC Council of Foreign Ministers. Now, what is the other component of global stage beside this United Nations General Assembly and others? That's part of our resistance to genocide. That is international jurisprudence, international law in dealing with the genocide. We brought the genocide case to ICJ, International Court of Justice. ICJ has handed down the first ruling with four provisional measures to Myanmar to implement. Myanmar, as a signatory of 1948 Genocide Convention, has agreed to comply. OIC and the member state Gambia was highly successful in garnering the support from the international community for this case at ICJ. Many countries have already declared, like Canada and many other countries, that the crisis Rohingya people are facing in Myanmar, Burma, is a genocide, simply a genocide, because of these efforts, international coalition building. Currently, there are 2 resolutions at the Capitol Hill in Washington on determination of genocide against Rohingya people. Now, we must transform these efforts, all this effort, internationalizing the effort, to the international pressure on Myanmar from all angles to a sustainable impact on the ground in Myanmar. We want the situation to be resolved in Myanmar, prevent the genocide. This pressure must be effectively applied to prevent genocide, address accountability of crimes committed by Myanmar Burmese military, restoration of the full citizenship, restoration of full citizenship of Rohingya people with all their basic rights that have been revoked, recognition of their ethnic identity, Rohingya name as a national race, ethnic identity as Rohingya as a national race, security and safety for Rohingya, repatriation of refugees, and resettlement in their original homes in Rakhine State, their home state, with all their basic rights. Now, let me check the time here. I'm pretty close. Now,
Thank you.
what you, the Muslim Ummah and international can do. First, heavy public awareness for garnering more support from all faith, interfaith groups, all communities in the society. Organize more events like this one, even virtual during the pandemic. Reach out to your friends, families, neighbors, colleagues, co-workers, interfaith communities, and others. Reach out to your public elected public officials, from counties to a state level legislature to even US Congress in Washington. That's both House and the Senate in support of the current resolution, the House resolution 8744 and Senate resolution 4659, that is titled as Rohingya Genocide Determination Act of 2020. Inshallah, we'll succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wakar, for inspiring us with the ways via which the Rohingya people are resisting against a brutal military regime with nothing in their hands against all odds. Similar is the story in the Xinjiang province in East Turkestan, where I have had the pleasure of and privilege of traveling a couple of times over the last couple of decades, and I have met people and their resistance and their sustaining themselves deeply rooted in their faith and thousands of years of tradition in Xinjiang province in East Turkestan. To share more about that, we have requested and invited, and so pleased to have our sister Aydin Anwar, who is a Uyghur-American, and she has served as the team lead of the Save Uyghur campaign under Justice for All, which is a nonprofit organization here based in US. And during her youth and college years, she had worked heavily in East Turkestan advocacy by raising awareness through media, film, public speaking, and working on relief efforts for Uyghur refugees, particularly in Turkey and other places. And she has spoken on multiple media outlets, has been quite visible in the media space with her most notable piece on Now This, that has garnered, I believe, more than 100 million views worldwide. Sister Aydin holds a BA from Duke in International Comparative Studies, and she shares with us the West Coast, the left coast of the United States. She is from Seattle. So Sister Aydin, the floor is all yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining this really important discussion. I actually want to thank the previous speakers for shedding light on, the current occupations that are taking place all around the world. And all I could think of is even when Dr. Hafsa was speaking about what's happening in Kashmir is, the alarming similarities that take place. Even the fact that 1947, 1948, 1949 are all years where the occupation of these, of where Kashmir, Palestine, and East Turkestan have, taken place is even alarming in that sense as well. So I am Uyghur, originally from occupied East Turkestan, which is currently under the occupation of China, and China has renamed that region as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which, by the way, is a very ironic name in itself because it's by no means autonomous at all. Our most recent occupation took place in 1949, so we've been under a brutal occupation for again, seven or so decades now, and we call on everyone to use the term occupied East Turkestan to shed light on who we are. I mean, shed light on the nation itself, and also shed light in the fact that we are a Turkic people that have been brutally taken over and still undergo that oppression. And now, subhanAllah, we have, unfortunately, the oppression has gotten to the scale, to the point where we have concentration camps that have been the largest since Nazi Germany, when we had the Holocaust take place. Right now, we have concentration camps holding millions of Uyghurs and other Turkic people, and now even Hui Muslims and Tibetans, basically as a way to forcefully brainwash these detainees, have them commit their loyalty to the Communist Party, and in that process be subject to things like forced labor, extermination, and other genocidal tactics. But majority of these detainees are specifically Uyghur Turks. I myself have 93 relatives missing. When I say missing, I mean that we cannot pick up the phone right now and even try to call them, because doing so would actually put them in danger and actually be a big reason why someone would be sentenced to prison or sent to a camp. So within those 93 relatives, we don't know how many are in these camps and prisons. That's one of the greatest, honestly, one of the greatest pains that we in the Uyghur diaspora feel, is not knowing. There's the fear of the unknown, not knowing exactly what is happening to our family. The fact that we can't even pick up our phone and hear the voice of our loved ones. I have Uyghur friends here who haven't spoken to their parents in 3-4 years now, because doing so, again, would endanger them. Or some of them are actually just in these concentration camps where they have zero access to the outside world. And again, their children here don't know anything that's happening. And they pray that their parent doesn't come out of these camps dead, which has happened to thousands of individuals, previously. And to this day, these atrocities take place. Because I only have, limited time, unfortunately, I can't really go too much into detail about what is happening. But one thing I wanted to really emphasize with you, and something that, so even the organization that I had been working for, Justice for All, had been saying for years now. Me and my family had been saying this for since I was a kid. My dad was constantly saying this is a genocide. Unfortunately, even the media, just until recently, people were really shying against using that term, because they would say things like, "Oh, we don't have enough evidence. We can't say that it's intensive, that there's mass killing. Therefore, we have to shy away from using that term in order to maintain our credibility." But now we see that evidence, that all of what we had been saying is actually turning out to be true. So the 5 conditions of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, if you go through all 5 conditions, every single one of them is met, including the first one, which is killing the group members of the group of people. And one of those, one of the actions that really that help basically fall under that category is through mass organ harvesting. We have disturbing reports that have come out of the region describing how these prisoners, who are, by the way, put into these camps and prisons for arbitrary reasons, like saying assalamu alaikum, having more than 5 people in their home, having a Quran recitation audio on their phone, having the name Muhammad, having more than 2 kids. Like, all of these random reasons that China criminalizes, these are all reasons that you could be sent to these, essentially these genocidal facilities, whether they be camps or actual prisons. And so we have reports of organ harvesting coming out, where they actually cut into live prisoners and take their organs and sell them off to the black market for exorbitant prices, anywhere from $100K to $250K, depending on the organ itself. We have reports of forced abortions taking place, where if a woman gets pregnant for more than a second time, that she is then forcibly, either after her 9-month term, which, by the way, that's not even considered abortion at that point. That's just plain, killing a baby's infant, is murder. And they have reports of hundreds of thousands of women being subjected to that. And also we have reports of we even have testimonies coming out of these camps and prisons, where these people are talking about how like dozens of people are coming out dead every week from these camps. One specific camp survivor, she talked about during her 3 months in detention, she was in a crowded cell with over 60 other women, and during those 3 months, 9 women had died in front of her. So if you do the math, and people will argue that you need a larger sample size in order to make some kind of generalization and a probably a better estimate of how many people are dying. But because we have such limited info about what's happening in China, it remains to be the secretive regime. We estimated with that one number that within 3 months, let's say, assuming that 1 million people are in these camps, which by the way, there are actually much more, that within 3 months, over 300,000 people would be coming out dead from these camp facilities. So just to put things into perspective as we're, learning about what's happening. And then the second condition, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions which bring about physical destructions in whole or in part. So some of the examples is forced DNA tests on the majority of the population in order to, and for those who are into science and probably know what you can do once you have the DNA of a person, you can literally erase, an entire race. You can sequence the DNA. You can check to see if they're, are a good fit for organ harvesting and doing whatever other sinister intention that the Chinese government has in place for these Turkic people. You have mass surveillance. You even have surveillance in your own home where Chinese government officials live inside your home to make sure you're not engaging in religion and to make sure you're not, to assess your political views. These government officials sleep in the same bed, often are encouraged to sleep in the same bed as the people living in the home. Sometimes even male government officials are forced to sleep in the same bed as the Uyghur women whose husbands are in the concentration camps. So what does this sound like to you? It sounds like state-sponsored rape. And then with this also comes with, like I said, criminalizing all acts of worship and day-to-day activities. One person had really put this, described the pain of living in East Turkistan as like you're suffocating every day, but you're not dying. So it's like we're the walking dead every day, but because suicide is haram or forbidden, we feel like we're dying every day, but we just can't kill ourselves because we're not allowed to. And then there's causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group, including through the methods of torture, drugging of prisoners and detainees, forced medications, forced labor. Now we have these reports that have been coming out showing how a bunch of these companies that we ourselves are using right now, even Apple, was recently caught lobbying against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. These companies are now fully complicit in what is happening and employing modern day Uyghur slaves who were initially put into the camps and now transferred, or not even transferred, but just, now being used as these forced laborers. And then forcible transfer of children of the group. You have an estimated 500,000 or more children being separated from their parents and then sent to state-run orphanages where they're subjected to brainwashing and taught to hate their own religion and identity, and then subject to things like abuse and torture as well. And lastly, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So we also have reports coming out of forced sterilization of Uyghur women and men. In these camps, they would often be forced to take these what they, the detainees wouldn't know what these are, but they would be pills that would essentially cause sterilization. Oftentimes, there were also testimonies describing how women would be brought to these health clinics, claiming that they're doing a physical checkup, but in reality, all they're actually being an IUD is being inserted, or something is done to sterilize the woman, or even for the men, something to cause infertility, essentially. So these are all methods of just making sure that the next generation of Uyghurs and other Turkic people do not exist, and this is their way of trying to maintain tight control over the mineral-rich land. The reason I wanted to kind of go through those 5 conditions so people understand that this is much worse than what it's painted as. Oftentimes when you look at what the media is talking about, they'll say things like, oh, this ethnic minority in China, these Chinese Muslims, which by the way are all terms that we as Uyghurs detest, because for the longest time, we were the majority of our homeland. We're not Chinese. We're Turkic people with our own language, our own culture. We have, centuries of really rich, history. Islamic civilizations emerged out of that region, and now it's all being destroyed. We're being destroyed physically as a people and culturally as well. China is also destroying our mosques. You're not even allowed to, again, saying Assalamu alaikum. You cannot say the word God. You have to replace God with the CCP. So instead, a lot of times Muslims say Inshallah, which means God willing. So instead of saying Inshallah, you have to say Insha CCP, or Insha Xi Jinping, or Insha China. Whatever. We could be essentially trying to replace God with with the Communist Party. And one thing I want to kind of say before I close off really quickly, I wanted to share with you all a personal experience. Last summer, actually, I was blessed with the opportunity to go to Palestine, actually with AMP, alhamdulillah. And part of, a big reason for this was not just to visit the Holy Lands, but also for me to kind of get a sense of the oppression firsthand, or at least see it. And obviously, I'd never lived in Palestine, so I can't say I experienced it firsthand. But seeing the forms of oppression manifested around us, and it was a 10-day trip, and I would say I came back, I felt blessed. We saw, Al-Aqsa, and I know that I almost felt guilty because I knew there were Palestinians within, the West Bank who were never able to see Al-Aqsa themselves. They were never able to visit it. And I, as this Uyghur-American, happened to just go on this trip and be able to, see the Dome of the Rock and experience all these beautiful, these beautiful holy sites. So to see that also made me feel guilty. And I was like, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but when Palestinians can't even see this part of their land. But one thing I wanted to share with you is during that trip, I remember feeling blessed, but also very angry, not just at every instance of oppression that I saw being so similar to what is happening in East Turkestan. I remember every time that we'd see someone would describe how you can't go from city to city, right? Somebody who was in Gaza couldn't go to Jerusalem. And so if your family or your loved one happened to be in that city, there were families who hadn't seen those loved ones for decades, even though they're not even that far apart. And immediately I thought, this is exactly what's happening in East Turkestan as well. You can't even move from a neighborhood to another neighborhood without being criminalized and sent to a camp. But one thing that I wanted to add was that, unfortunately, during that time period when I was, in Palestine, kind of learning about the oppression and picking up on things, one thing that I had realized was that I had been naturally comparing everything that was happening in Palestine and making comparisons to what was happening in East Turkestan. And unfortunately, each instance of oppression, I was immediately thinking, what's happening in East Turkestan is actually worse. And I felt guilty because I didn't want to say it out loud because I didn't want to minimize the kinds of pain and trials that people in Palestine were going through. And I didn't want to, even bring it up in the discussions that we were having as a group. I had a fellow Palestinian in the group as well. So I kept all to myself. But in my head, I was like, we were in Ramallah, for example, and the adhan was going off, and everyone was going to the masjid. It was a really beautiful scene. And and it's also, obviously, there are some areas of Palestine that are less, surveilled by the Israeli government. So I could see that. And I was like, in my head, I was like, oh, and at least they can at least go to the masjid, at least they can hear the adhan. At least they can walk around with the hijab. The woman can walk around with the hijab without being thrown into a camp, a torture-ridden, death-ridden camp or prison. At least they can name their babies, these Muslim names that they take so much pride in. So it became this almost unhealthy comparison game that I was playing, but I couldn't help it. And I'm deciding to share it, now is because I want people to understand, when we're thinking about these forms of oppression, not to play oppression Olympics, but just to understand the scale of this and how little knowledge the world has about what's happening in East Turkestan and the type of pain that is accompanied, knowing us as an Uyghur diaspora, how much we've been spending so much time and energy trying to educate the world about what's happening. I just want to, share that kind of almost frustration because it's painful, right? And alhamdulillah, I think now we have more awareness being taken place. The fact that I'm even on this webinar is such a huge blessing. I would say 5 years ago, we were never even given these spaces, even within places like, the United States, where we're not persecuted for speaking about these issues. And so I remember even in high school, my dad had organized a conference in the public library because these conference rooms were free, and we had an awareness event. We spent months advertising for this awareness event just to have 15 people come out, and it was honestly, I remember that time just being so frustrating, and I was in late high school then, and I was like, how are we going to educate people? How are we going to have this genocide stop when only 15 people come to these events? But subhanAllah, how, you know, things change. Allah helps the oppressed and you know, bolstering its cause. But unfortunately, we had to get to the point where these mass concentration camps have been built in order for this issue to even be talked about. So I would want to close off here, and, you know, inshallah, if you guys have any questions, we're obviously we're gonna be answering them. So just to, you know, I hope what I said was of value, and you learned a little bit more about the extensive oppression this genocide is taking place, and that you know, hopefully the personal anecdote in Palestine maybe even puts into perspective about the type of pain we feel as a people. And inshallah, may Allah relieve all of our pain and this solidarity and bring us more solidarity. And I'm so blessed to be on this panel with such esteemed people who are also fighting for their own, I want to say their own, all of our causes as a collective ummah.
Thank you so very much, Sister Aydin. And I have so much to share, but because of the brevity of time, I do have some questions for all of you, and I would request sort of a rapid fire Q&A quickly, and I'll stay with you, Aydin, and then go in reverse order and close with Sister Angana. But before I do that, for those of us who are watching this program, and also our esteemed panelists, do please join AMP in about an hour at 8 o'clock Eastern time for a presentation against on all that AMP has done and continues to do. This particular session is to express our solidarity and commitment, reaffirm our commitment that AMP, although focuses its work on Palestine, but not exclusively on Palestine, we stand in solidarity with all people everywhere whose basic human rights and dignity is compromised. So I would urge and welcome all of us to, immediately after this program, log back in at 8 o'clock EST, 5 p.m. PST to join the virtual gala, where some of our congressional reps also shall be joining us. And those of us who would like to can also share these presentations. I have seen several comments that, wow, I did not know this is happening, and that's happening in Myanmar, in East Turkistan and Kashmir in India. This will be saved, so you can always revisit back to American Muslims for Palestine's Facebook page and YouTube page and see these videos and share with others as well. With that, quickly again, short answers, as succinct as possible. I know it's very difficult, but let's try our best. Sister Aydin, you have been reminding us online, and I follow you and you follow me on Twitter about the boycott of various US products. Can you talk a little bit about that quickly?
Sorry, can you repeat the first few words you said?
The boycotting of various US-made products that we use in US that are made.
Oh, the boycott. Okay. Yes. So there was a recent report released by ASPI. If people want to go into it more, Google Uyghurs for Sale report. It'll show up a report that lists out 83 companies that were caught using forced labor, Uyghur forced labor. Some of these companies have promised that they will stop. So some of them include H&M, Adidas, but there are some that have not responded at all, who have claimed that it's not happening. And so some of these off the top of my head include things like Zara, Nike, Puma, Victoria's Secret, even Apple has, and unfortunately now with Black Friday, a lot of people are buying the iPhone 12, buying AirPods. I myself am using Apple products, but a lot of us have purchased this a while ago before even knowing about how grave their practices have been. And so I can't really go through all of them right now for the sake of time, but I encourage you all to really do your research and look it up. The report is available online, and to really just make the effort to boycott and avoid these goods. Also, one more thing, when you guys go shopping, try to avoid clothing or items made in China. If the tags is made in China, I know it's hard because almost a majority of what you pick up is made in China, but even like understanding that as an act of sadaqah and realizing, okay, I'm not gonna, just because I want to save this much money, I want to buy this product. I feel like that itself is like a way of enacting or engaging or avoiding haram consumption. Because also I wanted to mention 80% of China's cotton actually comes from the East Turkistan region, which is now being used by and taken by modern day Uyghur slaves. And then 20% of the US cotton that is brought here is also from China. So you can do the math and think about the possibility that their clothing made in China may actually be made from modern day Uyghur slaves. So just keep that in mind, and let's all spread the word and to make these decisions.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much. I also read as early as this morning an editorial by the Washington Post about the US-made technologies that are aiding surveillance of Uyghur people in China. Going to Brother Wakar, if you would be so kind to kindly, as succinctly, as briefly as possible, to talk about what's next with the International Criminal Court of Justice, ICJ. You're on mute, Brother Wakar.
Oh, muted?
You're good now. Go ahead, please.
Okay. International Court of Justice, as you know, it has have a first ruling on provisional measures. The order Myanmar government, Burmese government, for implementation of certain things on the ground. So now Myanmar government was ordered by ICJ to submit report every 6 months about implementation of the order, about protecting Rohingya from genocide and range of things. Now Myanmar also, our side, Gambia side, has submitted to ICJ a memorial in last October. And now it's a given time, 9 months to Myanmar to submit counter memorial. So now genocide or determination of genocide will be coming down the road, but it may take some time. But at this point, these are submitting memorial and reports.
Thank you very much, Brother Wakar. I appreciate the brevity. I know that there is so much to expand on that. Going to Sister Hafsa, I know that in Kashmir, there are so many inspiring stories of women resisting a military regime, 1 million plus military people in India occupying the Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir. Share with us any instances, stories that you know of where women have stood up barehanded against fully armed military power of India.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So women have played an integral role in resisting the occupation in Kashmir in many ways, in ways that can be considered traditional or even non-traditional. Since for decades, really, they have been involved in protests, involved in assisting people who have been on the front lines. My colleague, Professor Chatterji, has written a book recently called Resisting Disappearance, where one of the main kind of icons of the Kashmiri resistance struggle is a woman named Parveena Hunger, who runs an organization called the Association of the Parents of the Disappeared Persons. And these are family members of people who have been disappeared, over 10,000, mostly young men, brothers, fathers, and so on. And they gather, they used to, once a month, and just hold up signs of the family members that are disappeared. And what Professor Zia basically argues is that this is a kind of mourning which should be seen as resistance, and it gives a space for women to be in the public eye and create that space for themselves, but still kind of doing it in ways that may be more traditional and more in touch with kind of the cultural contours of the place. And more recently, you've also seen these images of young schoolgirls, and not just from like rural areas, but even urban city schoolgirls who, alongside young boys, are throwing stones at the occupying army. So I think there's been different ways that women in the past have been resisting, which may have been more invisibilized. And now there are a lot of young women who are resisting through art, poetry, writing, but then also, on the streets as well.
Thank you so much for that. It's so inspiring to see some of the pictures, some of the videos that we have seen online of that type of resistance, where young women and mothers and grandmothers standing up against a brutal military regime, especially those mothers and those sisters who have lost their family members. And I draw these parallels with the Palestinian mothers and Palestinian sisters whom I've had the privilege to visit, and it is so inspiring. Before I go to Sister Angana, I think some people have asked whether the people who are targeted in Gujarat, in India, and Kashmir are Muslims. So the answer is yes, dominantly yes, although there may be some minorities of Christian tradition and other tribal traditions also. The quote-unquote the untouchables, 21st century India democracy, quote-unquote untouchables within the Hindu tradition. They also are the victims, but by and large, Muslims have been the victims of that. So Dr. Chatterji, I would like to go to you in asking if the current Hindu nationalist Indian government, as I see as a person who was born in India, grew up partly in India, I cannot go back to India now. I'm denied going back to India. God knows why. I'm wondering if the minorities, whether they are Sikhs, whether they are Christians, whether they are Muslims who have been living for centuries there, is the current Indian Hindu nationalist government trying to make all of these folks the permanent other in India now?
Thank you, Shakeel Bhai. I'm sorry that you cannot go back. It is a way of punishing long distance. And as we know that Hindu nationalists are also extremely alive in the diaspora in the United States, for example, and the United Kingdom. With respect to your question, I think people who are not of dominant descent in India are other in India. I think that the notion of India itself breaks in through this othering of communities by Hindu nationalists, and having a country that is legally, socially, and politically a majoritarian state. I think that opportunities to belong for those who are vulnerable minority communities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, caste oppressed groups, and their allies are given by way of annihilation or assimilation. One can choose to assimilate by forgetting who one is, and this is where many of my colleagues on the panel spoke to those forms of othering today, to live through a process where one becomes unrecognizable to oneself or be annihilated. I think I am concerned that, or I would like people to recognize that India, before the takeover of the BJP through an electoral process in 2014, was not an equitable place. It was a place that was surfeit with inequities. The whole process of the partition itself was surfeit with inequities. The process of the colonization of Kashmir from 1947 onwards was surfeit with violence. So I think what we have seen is that all of the last 70 years led us to where we are today. It is not by chance that the BJP has taken power, that Narendra Modi is the head of government. It is because of who we have been as a state the last 70 years that we find ourselves in the predicament that we do today. The permanent othering of all that are non-Hindu, people of non-Hindu descent, or people of non-Hindu descent and their allies, I think if that occurs in India, it will break what India is. And I don't think that it can be. And it is a warning that the country itself, the state itself, would do well to heed. But of course,
I hope
not.
and pray that the resistance of the people will force India and all other places that we have talked about to not make that happen. At American Muslims for Palestine, our unconditional commitment is with people who are being persecuted in Myanmar, in East Turkistan, in Kashmir, in India, and other places, including some Muslim countries, whether it's in Yemen and Syria and other places, that we all stand in absolute solidarity with the oppressed people and celebrate the resistance in these places and are inspired. Again, as a reminder to the community, to those who are watching, do please remember to join us in another 45 some odd minutes to celebrate, continue this resistance against all odds in Palestine and elsewhere. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and Dr. Hatem Bazian, the chairman of the board of AMP, and Dr. Sama Abu Shaid, the executive director, along with a few other people, will be joining us at 8 o'clock PST. So do please remember to join us and support AMP to the best that you possibly. Volunteer, I always say talent, time, or treasure, the 3 T's. You're welcome to contribute, because this struggle of justice is not exclusively AMP's responsibility or the responsibility of the Rohingya Union or Aydin or Kashmir brothers and sisters. It is our collective responsibility that we stand for each other and with each other in any way, form, or shape that we possibly can. I like to close this afternoon, this evening, with the poet of resistance from Palestine, Mahmoud Darwish. He has many very profoundly written expressions, poetic expressions of resistance. And I just chose 2 lines of a particular poem that he wrote titled Silence for Gaza, or as my Palestinian brothers and sisters say, Gaza. And it's a long poem. And I conclude with these 2 lines. And you're welcome to think of the word Gaza that is used in these 2 lines and replace with any place of your choice. And it goes as follows. In Gaza, time is not for relaxation, but storming into the blazing noon to resist. So I invoke Brother Darwish for Myanmar, for East Turkestan, for Kashmir, for India, and all places that are living under oppression and continuing to resist against all odds. God bless you. Thank you so very much. And may you have a blessed evening and a weekend. And from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of the entire AMP family, I'd like to thank each one of you personally and professionally. Jazakumullah khairan, assalamu alaikum, and may you have a blessed evening. Thank you so much.